Hi Year 4, Mrs. Price here. We're going to be doing today's reading video, so get yourselves ready. Okay, in our lesson today, we're going to carry on with our retrieval skill, and we're going to be retrieving and recording information from a non-fiction text. In today's lesson, what we're going to be doing is thinking about all of our learning so far this week, bringing it all together to find the advantages, the good points, and the disadvantages, the bad points, of living close to a river. So if we have a look at this text here, you can join in as I read it, or you can just listen. River settlements. Hundreds of years ago, many settlements grew up beside rivers, and these are some of the famous towns and cities we know today. Bewdley and Worcester are a town and a city in the county of Worcestershire. And I know that with Mrs. Evans, you've been doing lots of thinking this week about Bewdley. What I want us to do is have a look at the two photographs underneath and see if you can decide which one is Bewdley and which one is Worcester. Okay, have a careful look. If we look at this picture here, there's a clue there. That's the cathedral. Okay, you know which has a cathedral? Is that Bewdley or Worcester? Okay, oh, well done. If you thought this one was Worcester, Worcester has a cathedral. And here, this is Bewdley. Well done. So the first thing we need to do to help us decide the advantages and disadvantages of living close to a river is have a look at the text and reread it. So again, you can either listen or join in with me if you can. So why live near rivers? People can use the water for drinking and washing. Farmers can water their crops or provide water for their farm animals to drink. Crops grow well on the rich soils of river floodplains. These soils are built up from layers of river mud, which the river deposits along its bank in times of flood. Fast-flowing rivers can be used to drive machinery or generate electricity. Rivers are water highways, useful for transporting goods and people. People use rivers in their leisure time for activities such as canoeing and fishing. At the mouth of some rivers, sheltered deep water sites make ideal ports or harbours for fishing, trade or industry. Okay, so as we read that, is it saying it's an advantage or a disadvantage of living by a river? Is it positive things about living by a river, good things, or is it negative things, bad things? What do you think? Yes, that's right. It was telling us the advantages of living by a river, the good things about living by a river. Yesterday with Mrs. Evans, you read and saw photos of how flooding of the River Severn has affected Bewdley. Let's read this together and think of whether this is an advantage or a disadvantage of living near a river. Flooding in Britain. The first settlements were usually built away from marshy areas or places that might flood. Today, there are so many people living in Britain that more and more homes have to be built in areas at risk from flooding. People also like to build their homes on the flat land near rivers with a pleasant view. Okay, so having read that and thought about the work that you did yesterday, I'm sure you've worked out that flooding is a major disadvantage of living close to a river. Okay, if we have a look here, and let's read this together now and see what we think about these facts. Okay, so join in with me as I read. Living by a river. Many people think that living by a river is an ideal location, but living by a river can have disadvantages too, namely flooding. Imagine how worrying it would be to think that your home could be flooded. Another issue that people living by a river may have to deal with is noise. Rivers can be very active recreational areas, and therefore it can be very noisy. People may drive motorboats and could be yelling and playing loud music. Okay, so I think this tells us another disadvantage of living, another bad point of living close to a river because of the noise that you can perhaps have on a river. If people are having lots and lots of fun, perhaps in a motorboat. Okay, so again, the flooding is a big problem, but noise can also be a problem. So what we're going to do now is use the information in the text. So what we're going to do today is you are going to make a table like this. Here's the table in your book or on a piece of paper. You can either fold the piece of paper in half or draw a line down the middle of your page. And on one side, you're going to have the positives of living by a river. And on the other side, you're going to have the negatives of living by a river. And the title for our work is going to be River Settlements. Okay, so you're going to use all the information we found out this week and put it into a table. So I'm going to start with thinking of a positive point of living by a river. And I'm thinking that I'm going to look back at the text to find the information that I need. So I remember that this page has good points, advantages of living near a river, and as I scan the text, I am seeing that in their leisure time, people use the river for canoeing and fishing. Okay, so there I've got two good things about living near a river. And if I come back to my table, I'm going to write, or I'm going to type in my positive column, I'm going to put canoeing, because that is something which is a positive of living near a river, something good that you can do. Okay, so I found a positive. Now I'm going to see if I can think of a negative reason of living by a river. So I'm going to look here at this information about living by a river, and scanning the text, I can see disadvantages, namely flooding. Okay, so I'm going to take that piece of information and pop it in the table. Okay, and here I'm going to type in flooding. I'm going to put flooding of homes, because that's a major negative of living near a river. Okay. So when you have filled your columns with negative and positive reasons, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make a poster. Okay, and you can either choose the good points about living near a river, the positive advantages, or you can choose the disadvantages and make a poster. Okay, so if we have a look at the positive reasons first, I've decided to call it I would like to live by a river because, and then you can draw some pictures and give the reason beside the picture. So here, I would like to live by a river because, dot, 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 my ellipsis, of the beautiful views. Here I've got a photo of people canoeing. Say it would be fun to canoe. And another reason is that farmers can grow crops and their cattle can drink water. Okay, so you can either choose to do the advantages of living near a river or the disadvantages. Okay, so chili ones, if you can make sure you find the reasons for living by a river, the good or the bad. If chili twos, because explain their reasons too. And chili three, if you could justify your reasons with some examples. Okay, so think of things that have actually happened. Okay. And I know that all the teachers will be really looking forward to seeing your posters that you do, where you have retrieved the information from the text and turned it into a poster. Okay, so have fun doing that.
Okay, chapter 12, Cyra and the Sea. When we all got to school that first Monday of the second term, it turned out that nearly everyone had heard of Ahmet's story. It had spread over the holiday more quickly than news of a new flavour packet of crisps, and just as quickly as he had become famous for being the boy that beat Brendan the bully. Ahmet became famous for being the refugee boy. I don't think anyone kept their promise to Mrs. Khan of not asking him any questions, because everyone in class tried to sneak in at least one whenever they talked to him. Even Josie and Michael and Tom couldn't help themselves and started to ask him things like, "Did you have cheese sandwiches in Syria?" Or, "What was the weather like in Greece?" Or, "Did you ever eat snails and frogs in France?" I don't think Ahmet minded because we were his friends. If he understood the question, he would just answer yes or no, and if he didn't understand, he would just stare at us or shrug. But there were lots of people he didn't know asking him lots of questions too. Some of them asked him so many questions in one go that even we couldn't understand what they were saying, and we could speak English. Some classes even began to send messengers to see if they could find anything out. Messengers are usually the smallest kids in a class, and they're paid in sweets or football stickers or extra lunch tokens to get information. Some of them are okay and leave you alone if you tell them that you don't want to say anything, but the ones that work for the school bullies are especially annoying. It's not their fault really, because they get beaten up if they go back with nothing new to tell, but sometimes they won't listen to you even after you've given them an answer. The most annoying messenger in the whole school is Victor. Victor's extra skinny, even though he eats chips every day and he has a gold earring in his ear. He works for two upper school bullies whose names I don't know, but who always hang around the lower boys' toilets and shake anyone that goes in until everything falls out of their pockets. But he also works for a group of girls who always stand around the water fountain, so you never really know who he's messaging for. After everyone had found out that Ahmet was a refugee, Victor followed us around for nearly a whole week. At break times and at lunch times and even at home times, he would suddenly appear and ask lots of questions that even I found strange, like, "Where did you get your shoes from?" And, "Are you scared of fireworks?" Or, "Can you make a tent from a shirt?" And, "Are you really 9 or are you secretly older?" He got so annoying that even the break duty teachers began to notice and told him to leave Ahmet alone, except Mr. Irons. He was the only teacher who didn't say anything. After he got told off by Mrs. Sanders and Miss Hemsley one break, Victor stayed away, but his questions stayed with us. Sometimes words hang around longer than people, even when you don't want them to. And whenever I was on my own, or just with Tom and Josie and Michael, Victor's questions would pop up into my head and make me wonder what he meant. The only thing that was even more annoying than the messengers was Brendan the bully, because instead of being nicer to Ahmet after seeing his pictures and hearing his story, Brendan the bully became even more horrible. He seemed to have forgotten that Ahmet could turn into a lion and punch him hundreds of times, because he began to whisper, "Oi, smelly refuge bag," whenever he saw him, and in class he would throw spitballs whenever Mrs. Khan or Miss Hemsey weren't looking. When we told Ahmet to tell Mrs. Khan or Mrs. Sanders about it, he shook his head and said, "I not scared. Lots of badder people in camps. My dad say I fight them, so I fight them." When Ahmet said this, I thought he was very brave. So on Halloween, I brought him one of my favourite Tintin books for him to look at, because in it, Tintin stays and fights lots of bad guys, even though the bad guys are bigger and there are lots more of them. There are always lots more of them. "See, you're like this. See," I said, showing him the book. I was dressed as a vampire and Ahmet was dressed as a green monster, although Tom said it was the Hulk. We were sitting in the playground on our own because Tom and Josie and Michael were still eating their lunch and taking too long. "Tintin!" he cried out when he saw the cover. "You know Tintin?" I asked, surprised. I hadn't really thought about it before, but I guess Tintin is famous everywhere. "Yes," said Ahmet, "I read all time. My dad, he read them to me." I nodded, remembering the voices that my dad used to make when he read the comics to me too. After a while I said, "I have all of them. You can see them if you like." "I keep this?" asked Ahmet. "Oh," I said, I hadn't really meant to give him the book. I'd only wanted to show it to him. But I knew that I could ask Mum to find me another old copy in the library and save it for me when it was about to be thrown away, so I shrugged and said, "Sure." Ahmet gave me a big smile and started to flick through it. He stopped at a page and pointed at Captain Haddock. "My dad, he had this," he said, moving his finger so that it pointed to Captain Haddock's beard. "You?" I shook my head. "No, my dad didn't have a beard, but also, my dad, he's dead." Ahmet nodded sadly and looked down at the picture. "I not know where is dad? Maybe he dead too." I looked over at Ahmet. "He's not here in London?" I asked. Ahmet shook his head. "I come here. My dad, he behind." I frowned. "Behind? Where?" Ahmet shrugged and looked down at the comic book. "Maybe he's in France." "Oh," I said, feeling sad for him. I'd hate it if I didn't know where my dad was, or even if he was still alive. I wanted to ask who the lady in the red scarf was and whether she could help him find his dad, and where his mum and his sister and his cat were. But then Ahmet flicked to another page and held it up to me. He was pointing to a picture. In it, Tintin and Captain Haddock and Snowy and a man with an eye patch on were all standing on a raft in the middle of the ocean, and Captain Haddock was waving a flag that had been made out of his blue jumper. "See," said Ahmet quietly. I nodded. "I have sister," he said. "She there now." "You mean here?" I said, pointing to the raft. "No," said Ahmet. "Here," he pointed to the ocean, and then I understood. "Oh," I said. I felt strange, as if something had just hit me on the inside of my chest. It was the same feeling I had in the hospital when Mum and Uncle Lenny told me that Dad had died. "You mean your sister? Her name is Cyra," said Ahmet. "Cyra? She is in the sea." Ahmet nodded and rubbed his eyes. "Then she's not with your cat?" I asked quietly. Ahmet shook his head. "Cat dead. In mountains." And then flicking to another page, he pointed to a tent and said, "Mum's sick. Last time I see her." "Oh," I said. I wanted to cry, but Ahmet wasn't crying, so I didn't think I should either. Instead, I stared at the picture he was pointing to just as hard as I could so that he couldn't see my eyes. We didn't say anything else after that, because a few seconds later, Michael and Josie came out and joined us. Tom was still inside because it was chocolate pudding day, and he always tried to get an extra piece after everyone else had left. I waited to see if Ahmet would show them the pictures and tell them about Cyra and the sea and his mum too. But he didn't, and when he looked at me and shook his head, I know that he wanted me to keep it a secret. I nodded back and made a silent promise to Ahmet that I wouldn't tell anyone. But I didn't know that I would be forced to break my promise the very next day, because that was when I heard something, and it was so scary that it changed everything. Oh, have to wait till tomorrow to find out.